Hi, History 115. Welcome back. This is week 11, lecture number 2. And today we're going to be talking more about the Great Leap Forward, a bit about Chinese-Soviet relations, and then we're going to be moving on into the Cultural Revolution. We may not get through everything, but we will get through as much as we can. So let me put up the terms to start with. Here we are, Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution. We're going to begin with a recap from last time when we were talking about the Great Leap Forward. And when we left off, we were specifically talking about the backyard furnaces campaign. Remember, so by 1958, the peasants of China were being organized into ever larger communes. By November of 1958, again, 98% of the farming population of China, which is the vast majority of the country, was organized into just 26,000 communes, each of them with about 25,000 people in it. Everything was communal in these communes. Communal kitchens, communal ownership of property, communal fields. And again, as I said, the earnings from the commune were per capita. Everyone got an equal share regardless of what particular labor they contributed. Put this down a little bit. At the end of the last lecture, I was talking about the campaign to produce steel locally in July of 1958. I'll put up the image. Those hundreds of thousands of backyard furnaces put up in the communes in the hopes of smelting steel and just leading, hopefully leading to this incredible surge in China's steel output. The unintended consequence was, in fact, the destruction of most useful metal implements on the communes, and the production of pig iron, which was not useful for industrial purposes. Furthermore, an enormous amount of deforestation to feed these million furnaces and keep them running around the clock. That deforestation led to flooding, and this is going to lead to further ecological disaster. Again, just recapping from last time, that in 1958, at least there was good weather and there was a decent harvest, but even those numbers were largely inflated for the central government. 1959, the weather was much worse, and the central government, again, this is still recap, but the central government had increased its quotas for 1959 based on the inflated statistics from 1958. So huge amounts of labor were being mobilized for various public works projects, and there simply weren't enough people in the fields to bring in the grain that was coming up. Yet, the government continues to demand more from the communes based on the local officials' inflated figures that they've sent up. So the government demands more, the communes have to supply it, even as their own productivity is actually going down. You can imagine where this is heading. The crisis moment came at a meeting of the Communist Party's Central Committee at the mountain resort of Lushan, that's Lushan, in July of 1959. And just looking ahead, this meeting of the Central Committee really sets the stage for the Cultural Revolution that's going to come a few years later. Our main figure here is a man named Peng Dehuai. We've met him before. I'm going to put his image up on here. Here he is with Mao. Make him visible to me. Here we are. So this is Peng Dehuai on the left. Here's Mao on the right. Peng Dehuai was a remarkable figure, a hero of the early People's Republic. He goes all the way back to Hunan with Mao. So he's also a guy from Hunan, an early revolutionary, an early leader in the Red Army. At Yan'an during World War II, he was the top commander. In the Korean War, he was the leader of China's armies. So he's this central figure to China's military history in the 20th century. Again, top commander at Yan'an, leader of Chinese armies in the Korean War. And in 1959, he was the defense minister, and also part of the Central Committee, the top-ranking people in the Communist Party. Peng Dehuai was concerned about what was happening in the Great Leap Forward, and he had received reports about the suffering of peasants in his home province of Hunan, and he was critical of what was happening. He realized that this was an unsustainable program, and so at this meeting of the Central Committee in Lushan in 1959, again, July of 1959, Peng reported on the suffering of the peasants to Mao, sort of remonstrating with him to try to get him to understand that his Great Leap Forward was not actually working and that it was leading towards a disaster. He had intended his criticisms to be private, just between him and Mao, old friends from Hunan, but Mao sensed that his reputation was on the line, and he had a rather exaggerated response to this criticism. Just to give you a sense of how their minds differed on this subject, I have two poems here. One written by Peng Dehuai about the peasants at this time, and one written by Mao Zedong. So first we have Peng. This is Peng Dehuai, who saw that the Great Leap Forward was not working as it was supposed to, and saw real dangers in the countryside. So here is Peng Dehuai's poem. In it he writes, millet is a kind of grain. Millet is scattered all over the ground. The leaves of the sweet potatoes are withered. The young and the strong have gone to smelt iron. To harvest the grain there are children and old women. How shall we get through the next year? I shall agitate and speak out on behalf of the people. So this is Peng Dehuai's poem. He's this vision of grain scattered on the ground. The leaves of the sweet potatoes are withering because all there is to harvest the grain is children and old women, because all of the strong men have been sent off to work at the backyard furnaces. The young and the strong have gone to smelt iron. To harvest the grain there are children and old women. How shall we get through the next year? And Peng Dehuai at the end of this poem says, I shall agitate and speak on behalf of the people. So I will speak to Mao and make him understand what is happening in the countryside. By contrast, here is Mao Zedong in 1959, writing about the peasants of Hunan. And here, this is 1959, he's casting his mind back to 32 years earlier, to 1927, to that report on the Hunan peasant movement that I read to you from earlier on. So he's looking back to 1927 with the Hunan peasant uprisings. So here he is, 1959. And as I read this, see through his eyes what he imagines the countryside is at this point. Cursed by the flow of memories, I am back in my native place 32 years ago. Red flags flutter from the spears of the enslaved peasants as the landlords raise their whips in cruel hands. It took many sacrifices to make us so strong that we dared tell sun and moon to bring a new day. In delight, I watched the waving rows of rice and beans, while all around the heroes return through the evening haze. So he's looking back and remembering 1927 and these peasant uprisings. And he writes that we dared tell sun and moon to bring a new day. Here is voluntarism, that the people united can conquer anything. They can tell the sun and the moon to bring a new day to China. And this vision of fertility, in delight, I watched the waving rows of rice and beans, compared to Peng Dehuai's image of the withering vines of the sweet potatoes and the millet scattered on the ground. Mao believed everything was going very well, and he was furious when Peng Dehuai criticized him. As I said, they go way back together. They're from the same native place in Hunan. They've been together in the revolution through the Long March, through the early PRC. Peng Dehuai is his most trusted general, leading the forces in Korea, now defense minister. But Mao took this criticism as a personal attack. As I said, Peng intended this to be a private criticism. Mao he printed up 150 copies of the letter that Peng Dehuai presented to him, printed up 150 copies, circulated it to the entire Central Committee, all of the senior cadres who were at this conference, had them all read it, and then had face-to-face interviews with all of them, asking them, are you on Peng Dehuai's side or are you on my side? Then he had Peng Dehuai purged along with everyone who had followed him. And as he apparently shouted at this meeting, if you side with Peng Dehuai, I'll raise another Red Army and start the revolution again. In other words, if the Central Committee follows Peng Dehuai, I'll just go back to the countryside, I will start the revolution from the beginning and I'll overthrow all of you. So Peng Dehuai was removed. Everyone who agreed with him was likewise removed. A man named Lin Biao, he's a term today, Linbiao, a deeply loyal Mao follower who would not question him on anything, took Peng Dehuai's place and was made defense minister. The removal of Peng Dehuai was followed by another purge, another anti-rightist campaign to root out any further critics of the party or critics of the Great Leap Forward who were branded as followers of Peng Dehuai and struggle. So in reaction to this, this could have been a turning point in 1959. Mao decided to double down on, I hate that expression, but it works here, to go forward with the Great Leap Forward with even more zeal. So in reaction, the government pushes forward with the Great Leap Forward, demanding grain from regions that cannot support it any longer. And this is where the real crisis occurs, starting around 1959. The government's share of each commune's produce has to be handed up, whether they have it to spare or not. And so as they hand up their quota to the government to be distributed to the cities to feed the city dwellers, the peasants in the communes are not left with enough to feed themselves. Some are left with only a fraction of what they need in order to stay alive. And mismanagement on the communes, mobilizing huge amounts of labor for land reclamation projects or moving mountains from one place to another or backyard furnaces. This mismanagement meant that, again, there was not enough labor even to harvest the grain that did come up. By 1960, the rural economy of China had broken down completely and there was mass starvation throughout the countryside. One of the amazing things about this, though, is due to incredibly tight control of information in China, nobody really knew what was going on while this was happening. The people in the cities who read the newspapers were unaware that anything was happening in the countryside, other than that huge amounts of grain were being grown and the Great Leap Forward was a massive success. Nobody abroad, nobody outside of China knew what was happening. In the communes where people were starving, they still read newspapers that told them that all the other communes were doing wonderfully. And so people who were starving during this time often believed that it was just a local problem, that it was just their commune, it was just their immediate area, without realizing just how widespread this is. And as I said, the best estimates say 20 to 30 million people starved to death in these years. There are arguments that maybe even Mao did not realize what was going on. For the most part, he lived in the Forbidden City. He lived in relative luxury compared to most of the country. And when he did go out from the capital in Beijing to make inspection tours, the local officials all took pains to make sure everything looked good for him, to the point that there were times when his train was scheduled to come through an area, and communes mobilized to uproot all of the rice shoots, all of the rice that was supposed to be growing on their fields, and plant it all along the train tracks. So that as Mao came through the area and he looked out his window, he would see fields full of grain. All of this grain had been forcibly transported from other places. Not long after the train went by, it would all wilt and die, but it was all done in order to create this impression for him. In any case, whether he knew what was going or not, whether he was just willfully pushing forward with this, whether he was somehow insulated by the officials around him, nevertheless, for anybody to criticize the Great Leap Forward was to criticize Mao, and you would likely meet the same fate as Peng Dehuai. So we'll step aside from the disaster of the Great Leap Forward for a moment here. And we're going to talk a little bit about international relations at this time of the Great Leap Forward. This is the period where we begin to get into the Sino-Soviet split. As far as the relations between China and the Soviet Union, as I told you earlier on, back in the early days of the Communist Party in China, Westerners all assumed that Mao was in Stalin's pocket and that the Chinese communists were simply an outgrowth of the Soviet Union. Edgar Snow, with Red Star Over China in 1937, after visiting Yan'an, argued that no, in fact, the Chinese communists are an entirely independent movement that is not following the orders of the Soviet Union. They are Chinese patriots trying to solve Chinese problems, and they're doing a really good job of it. So during World War II, it was understood that there was some difference between the Chinese communists and the Soviets. But the United States' decision to support Chiang Kai-shek in the Civil War pushed them hard enough apart from the Chinese communists that Mao's only real international ally, as he saw it, because the US represented the entire West, was Stalin. So following the Civil War, Mao indeed did become quite close to the Soviet Union. And as I said earlier, he modeled himself after Joseph Stalin. So the Sino-Soviet split, the relationship between the USSR and the People's Republic of China is not going to remain very good for very long. Through the early 1950s, the Soviet Union provided China all kinds of advisors and various kinds of aid. The division between them, and this is going to lead to an all-out rift, practically a nuclear war by the time we get to the late 1960s. The rift begins with Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin, which I talked about in an earlier lecture. But still, Mao towed the line. In 1957, Mao went to Moscow for a second visit, visited with Khrushchev. This was the 40th anniversary of the USSR, and Mao gave a speech in Moscow about Soviet leadership and supremacy, and so accepting the Soviets as the leaders of worldwide communism. And as he said in that speech, the east wind is prevailing over the west wind. The east wind is communism in Russia and in China, and it will prevail over the imperialist democracies of the West. During that visit in 1957, Mao and Khrushchev made an agreement that the Soviets would share their nuclear technology with China. Hold on to that. So things were still going fairly well in 1957, and then they start to really break down in 1958 and 1959 as we get towards the Great Leap Forward. Khrushchev, for his part, was quite skeptical of Mao, saw him as a romantic, not very well grounded, and Khrushchev was critical of the Great Leap Forward. He saw what was going on in China. He thought this was a pointless program, that it couldn't possibly work. So Mao was angry with Khrushchev for being critical of the Great Leap Forward. But to give a wider context here in 1958, let me put a map up for you. Here we go. Here we are. So here is China, here is Russia. You can see they share a long border. So Russia and China were quite close through 1957 or so. In 1958, the Soviet Union was trying to work out a peace agreement with Eisenhower in the United States. So 1958, the Soviet Union and America are engaged in talks trying to negotiate some kind of a peace settlement. And one of the biggest flashpoints between the Soviet Union and America was the Taiwan Strait, right here between Taiwan and China. Here, on one side of this Taiwan Strait, you have the KMT under Chiang Kai-shek, backed by the United States. On the other side of the strait, you have the People's Republic of China, backed by the Soviet Union. So the threat of renewed war in the Taiwan Straits was a threat of, ultimately it was a threat of war between the United States and Russia. That if a war broke out, the US would likely come in on Chiang Kai-shek's side, and Russia would probably come in on China's side if China needed it. So take that as your context. Khrushchev and Eisenhower are trying to negotiate some kind of a peace settlement in the Cold War between the Soviets and the US. One of the lingering flashpoints is this area between Taiwan and China. And now I want to go in close here. Here we have Taiwan, and here is mainland China right over here. Now, in terms of geography, when Chiang Kai-shek took Taiwan as his base of retreat, obviously the island of Taiwan was the big piece of this, but he held on to a series of islands. These ones, like the Pescadores, he held on to a series of islands going almost to the coast of the mainland, fortified them heavily because he knew that any amphibious invasion of Taiwan would have to use these islands as a stepping stone. And furthermore, if Taiwan could have advanced forces close to the mainland, then they could give an earlier warning of any forces that were trying to head towards Taiwan. Now, the island we're going to focus on here is Jinmen. On your terms, I wrote it as Jinmen. That's the pinyin romanization. It's also been written as Chinmen. It's been written as Quemoy, Quemoy. Your grandparents, maybe even your parents, probably know it as Quemoy because it was all over the headlines in 1958. So Quemoy, or Jinmen, I'm going to be calling it Jinmen, it's an island held by Taiwan that's literally just a little over a mile from the mainland in China. I've been there. You can stand on an outcropping there and very easily see mainland China. If you have binoculars, you can see people walking around on the beach over here. Okay, so it's extremely close. It's a heavily, heavily fortified defensive position for the KMT. They've dug tunnels there. They have all kinds of army supplies there. This is their little tiny aircraft carrier. Why does this matter? Because in August of 1958, in the middle of these negotiations between Khrushchev and Eisenhower, the negotiations between the Soviets and the United States, without warning anybody, Mao started bombing Jinmen. The Chinese and the PRC started hammering this island with artillery shells from the mainland. As I said, it's just over a mile from shore, so they can hit it with pretty good accuracy with their artillery. Why did Mao do this? Well, it was probably a way of him showing that he was not afraid of the United States and not afraid of Chiang Kai-shek in the midst of these negotiations. Eisenhower, in response to the bombing of Jinmen, sent the U.S. 7th Fleet, the U.S. Naval Fleet, through the Taiwan Strait to convoy KMT ships that were traveling there as a clear demonstration that the United States was going to back up the KMT if this turned into an all-out war. Zhou Enlai, that's Z-H-O-U-E-N-L-A-I, China's top diplomat, tried to open up talks with the United States. Ultimately, this does not result in a war between Russia and the US. It came close. But in the end, the Chinese back off. The Chinese in the People's Republic backs off. Mao and Zhou Enlai agree not to continue their continuous bombing of Jinmen, but wait for it. They agreed to de-escalate, and they would only bomb on even-numbered days. So they did not stop bombing Jinmen. They maintained the right to attack this KMT-held island just offshore. But going forward from 1959, they agreed that they would only bomb on even-numbered days, so every month on the 2nd, the 4th, the 6th, the 8th, et cetera, et cetera. This is going to continue all the way up to 1979. So think about that. For 20 years, the island of Jinmen gets bombed every other day by mainland China. Eventually, this is going to settle into a routine. Everyone who lives there digs a bomb shelter under their house. And on odd-numbered days, you can come out and farm, and the soldiers can run around outside and get the sun and play football or do whatever they did. No, not football, probably basketball. And then on the even-numbered days, they would go underground into their bunkers, and they would wait a while to hear where the bombs were dropping, because China didn't have so much artillery, so they would shoot a few artillery shells every other day. And if you lived on Jinmen, you would listen for these, and then once you heard them falling far enough away, you could come out and sleep in your own bed instead of being in your bunker. In any case, so from 1959 to 1979, China bombs Jinmen. Khrushchev was absolutely livid about this because, as he saw it, realistically, this bombing of Jinmen could have very easily led to a nuclear war between the United States and the USSR. This could have been the tipping point in the Cold War that led to the nuclear war that everyone feared. In response to this, Khrushchev broke his promise of sharing nuclear technology with China. That was June of 1959. He declared that he would no longer share any nuclear technology. By the mid-1960s, Khrushchev had pulled out all Soviet advisors from China, and there was, between the two countries, there was just a venomous falling out between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China that turns them ultimately into enemies by the mid-1960s. Significantly, when China did build, and I put 596 as a term on the board here, when China built its first nuclear bomb in 1964, the code name for the project was 596. That represented June of 1959, which is when Khrushchev said that the Soviets would no longer share any nuclear technology with China. So China mounted its own project named out of resentment of Khrushchev's betrayal in refusing to share their technology. A last word about Jinmen. Really nice place if you ever have a chance to go there. In terms of what happened to it in the long run, after all of those years of bombing, the big tourist product, the big export product of Jinmen, which is still held by Taiwan. And so a lot of Taiwanese go there. You can go there easily from the mainland. I was on one of the first boats that you could take directly from the mainland to Jinmen. The hope of the magistrate on Jinmen was to build casinos and get all the rich people from Fujian province to come over there and gamble. But in any case, the main tourism product of Jinmen is knives. Machetes, paring knives, kitchen knives, all kinds of knives. And everyone who goes to Jinmen for tourism comes home with various knives. Why? Because they have a huge amount of metal on the island from 20 years of being bombed by mainland China. So all of those shell casings from all of those artillery shells, they're collected and then they're worked in, and the metal is used to make knives, and then those are sold for export. So things turn out okay in the end for Jinmen. The other big export is that all of those bunkers underground on Jinmen that everybody had to have, it turns out that they're really, really good for fermenting liquor. So there is very famous sorghum wine that comes from Jinmen that's aged in everybody's little bunkers under their houses. Okay, so back to China. What we have now by 1959 and 1960, we have a serious irreparable rift between the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union. So going forward, it's really starting to look like China versus the world. America are their enemies from the Korean War. They're the imperialists. All the Westerners are behind them. The Soviet Union, now those are the revisionists going in the wrong direction of communism. They are our enemies as well. And China was increasingly isolated. Mao, for his part, had been ascendant through the beginning of the Great Leap Forward, but the inescapable failure of the Great Leap Forward, which is going to become something that no one can any longer sweep under the rug, is ultimately going to derail him. And he's going to be shunted aside by the early 1960s. Really shunted aside to a purely sort of a figurative place, as sort of a symbol. So looking forward, the last decade of Mao's life, from 1966 to 1976, was an unparalleled power struggle of Mao trying to get his position back at the top after the Great Leap Forward. And this power struggle was played out in terms of the total upheaval of China's urban society. These are the other of the 20 lost years, beginning with the anti-rightist campaign in 1957, going up to Mao's death in 1976. And there's still a major scar on contemporary Chinese society from this period. The people in their 60s and 70s are the ones who are most haunted by it, because they're the ones who were young during the Cultural Revolution. And many of them lost a lot during this period, as did their parents. So let's go back and see how this came about. What happens after this conference at Lushan, where Peng Dehuai tried to remonstrate with Mao? There was increased factionalism in the party after the Great Leap Forward. Some people were starting to be more critical of Mao for the problems of the Great Leap Forward and also for the split with the Soviets, but they didn't dare to say that. But following the conference, we have 3 years of abject starvation in the Chinese countryside, leading finally to a retreat from the policies of the Great Leap Forward. By 1960, you have the withdrawal of Soviet aid and the need of the Communist Party of China to supply answers to its own problems. In this period after the Great Leap Forward, as I said, Mao was shunted aside. He was still chairman of the Communist Party, and he was still the ideological figurehead. But in terms of the management of state affairs, he was shunted aside by Liu Shaoqi. He's one of your terms today. It's Liu Shaoqi, in Deng Xiaoping, that's Deng Xiaoping. So Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping stepped forward as leaders in the early 1960s, post-Great Leap Forward, and they lead efforts towards allowing a little privatization, allowing peasants to keep a small plot for themselves for their own gardening, allowing a return of certain consumer products, basically a return of personal individual incentives for work and to ensure that you were working to grow the food that you could eat. Mao, by the early 1960s, was out of favor because everyone now recognized the failure of the Great Leap Forward. Mao himself was bitter about this. He was angry about what he saw as a retreat from the revolution. He was angry with Liu Shaoqi, who was incidentally president of the state. So Mao was head of the Communist Party, but Liu Shaoqi held the presidency of the state. Mao saw a threat of capitalism returning to China. He did not want to see that. And above all, he feared losing control, and he was afraid of being undermined by Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. I mean, ultimately, he was afraid that Liu Shaoqi would do to him what Khrushchev had done to Stalin and denounce him as a tyrant who had made huge mistakes. So what Mao wanted was to retake his place at the center of the PRC's culture and its government. And the solution is going to be to shatter the party and shatter the state. This is the Cultural Revolution of 1966 to 1976. So how did this all begin? As I said, by 1964 or so, Mao was seriously worried about the direction Liu Shaoqi was taking the country, with this sort of reform and opening up, allowing private plots for farmers, that sort of thing. Fearful that he was going to be cast aside like Stalin had been in the Soviet Union. And frankly, most people at this point did not think Mao really mattered much anymore. He was old. He was 71 years old by 1964. He had Parkinson's disease. He was obese. He was really, it seemed like he was on death's doorstep. So he was, he was a beloved figure. He still had his cult of personality, which is going to grow. But he was not really seen as an active, engaged kind of emperor figure anymore. But where is his power? Now, remember that the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, China's military, is subordinate to the party, not to the state. Mao was the chairman of the Communist Party, and that meant that he had his loyalist, Lin Biao, Linbiao, the one who replaced Peng Dehuai. His loyalist was the head of the army. So since the army was subordinate to the party and Mao was the head of the party, Mao's power base at this point was in the army, which answered to him rather than answering to Liu Shaoqi, the head of state. Lin Biao, who was really Mao's greatest admirer, compiled what's called the Little Red Book of Mao's sayings. Let me put a picture of it. Here's a Little Red Book image here. Just move this where I can see it. Here we are. Mao Zedong, wan sui, wan sui. 10,000 years to Mao Zedong. 10,000 years. So this is, may essentially, may Mao Zedong live forever. Happy, cheering people holding up the little red book. What is the little red book? Here you can see it all over the place. The little red book, it was edited by Lin Biao, initially for use by the army. And it was a book of Mao Zedong, of quotations from Mao Zedong's writings and his speeches. So it's the collected quotations of Mao's works, the collected quotations of Chairman Mao Zedong. And it was edited down to this little book because you could carry it everywhere. It was like a little Bible. You could carry it and you could read it and you could study it. And Lin Biao, the defense minister and total loyalist of Mao Zedong, had all of the army read it. It was issued to all army personnel, and they sat around in study groups reading it and commenting on it, how wise it was, memorizing parts of it, having competitions to see who knew it better. And this is a way of indoctrinating the military of China. With a total loyalty to Mao Zedong, to see him again as the great leader, the one who will live forever. And in the midst of this, the sort of the most visible figure nationwide in this PLA study of Mao's works is a guy named Lei Feng, Leifeng. Let me put a little picture of him up here. There's going to be Uncle Lei Feng telling revolutionary stories to the children. Where is he? Here he is. All right, so here's Lei Feng. He is in your readings for Friday. Lei Feng, an admirable fool. The story of Lei Feng. Now, just to get this out of the way, there probably was a PLA soldier named Lei Feng, but we don't really know much about him. But he gets turned into a huge propaganda movement. There's still a Lei Feng Day in China where people are supposed to go out and do good deeds. At least I think there is. There was last time I checked. So Lei Feng supposedly was a PLA soldier who adored Mao Zedong, everything about him. And Lei Feng, was the model of a PLA soldier, the model of a socialist citizen. He was humble. He was very careful with his money. He did not waste anything. He saved little buttons and pieces of string and things like that in case they were needed for something later. He wouldn't waste anything at all. All of the money that he managed to save up, he spent buying more copies of the works of Chairman Mao, and because that's what gave him joy and that's what he loved. Lei Feng also, again, allegedly, spent all of his life doing good deeds, and everywhere he went, he would do good deeds for people anonymously, and he would write about them secretly in his diary without telling anyone about them. And then after he died, his diary was discovered, and what a wonderful diary it was. And then it was published and everybody read it, and there were campaigns for everybody to emulate Lei Feng, this humble, loyal follower of Mao from the People's Liberation Army. Now, a couple things about this. First of all, how did he die? It's very fitting for somebody like Lei Feng, who again is so humble, and his sort of highest calling is to admire Chairman Mao and perform good deeds. So he did not die heroically in any normal sense. He was not, he didn't get gunned down by the KMT. He didn't throw himself on a grenade to save his comrades. He was helping somebody back up a truck in the rain, and it hit a telephone pole that crashed down and fell on him and killed him. So sort of an ignominious death. But the thing about the diary is that once it comes out, then suddenly all of his good deeds were known, and everybody can follow him, and everybody can try to be him. Again, so he's still with us. So here in this image, here is Comrade Lei Feng, Uncle Lei Feng Shushu, telling stories of the revolution to the children, and all these rosy-cheeked children with their red scarves. That means they're in the Communist Youth League, so these are young communists getting ready eventually to join the party. And here is Lei Feng reading to them from the works of Chairman Mao with this, just this loving look in his eye. That is his love for the chairman. Incidentally, I went a few years ago. There is a museum for Lei Feng in his hometown. And again, we don't, there probably was an actual PLA soldier named Lei Feng. He was probably from this town. But you go to the museum and they have all kinds of artifacts from Lei Feng. And one of the main things they have is they have all these photographs of Lei Feng helping people. And you go through the museum and, here's Lei Feng helping an old lady cross the road, and here he is, helping some children do something, and here he is helping an old man. All these images of Lei Feng helping people. And so I was taking the little tour, and one of the Chinese people on the tour asked the tour guide, and they said, well, if Lei Feng did all of his good deeds anonymously, and we didn't know about them until after he died and we got his diary, then how do we have photographs of them? And so, good question. And the tour guide, I guess she'd gotten the question before, but she didn't miss a beat. And she said, well, it's because he was always doing good deeds. And so anytime there was a camera in the area that happened to capture Lei Feng on film, he was in the middle of doing a good deed. And therefore we have all these photographs, however you want to see it. But you'll be reading Lei Feng for Friday, and think about it both as a real story and as a propaganda piece. And what does this mean? What does this represent for China? But Lei Feng was really central to this cult of the Little Red Book, growing out of the army and then spreading to all of society. So the army become the teachers of the children, as you can see here, and then the children will be reading the Little Red Book, and then eventually they'll be carrying it with them wherever they go. So we have the Little Red Book. And we have Mao's loyalty in the army. His other leading helper was his wife, Jiang Qing, Jiangqing. She was his third wife. She's sort of a former second-rate Shanghai actress and a backstabbing politician, an extreme leftist, and obviously loyal follower of Mao. But she had a lot of influence in the Shanghai artistic world. And so she was leading a movement to reform culture and the performing arts in Shanghai. And at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, she's going to be joined by a handful of radical intellectuals who are going to be known later on as the Gang of Four. They're going to come back later. Now with Lin Biao, they are Mao's most ardent supporters. So the Cultural Revolution begins really in earnest with a cultural attack. Let me put Mao back up on here. Which Mao did we want? Yeah, let's go back to the Little Red Book. Here we go. All right, here we are. So I lost my place. Here we are, Cultural Revolution, beginning with a cultural attack. The attack was on newspaper editors and literary figures who had been sort of critical of Mao in really veiled ways, not directly criticizing him, but they're finding indirect ways of making allusions to the problems of Mao Zedong. So the flashpoint here, the first big attack, has to do with an article that was written by the deputy mayor of Beijing, the capital. His name was Wu Han, and he wrote an article in the People's Daily, the party mouthpiece, which was turned into a Peking opera. It was turned into an opera in 1961 called Hai Rui Dismissed from Office. Hai Rui is spelled H-A-I-R-U-I, and it's a name. Hai Rui Dismissed from Office. It's the article that leads to a Peking opera. And in the opera, as in the article, Hai Rui was an upright Ming Dynasty official. So this is veiled critique. So it's not about Mao and the PRC, it's about the Ming Dynasty long ago. So Hai Rui was an upright Ming official who was punished for criticizing the emperor. And in Hai Rui's words from the opera, from the article, quote, "For a long time, the nation has not been satisfied with you." This is Hai Rui addressing the emperor of the Ming Dynasty. And think of what this means in terms of Mao. All right, so Hai Rui speaking to the Ming emperor, "For a long time, the nation has not been satisfied with you. All officials in and out of the know that your mind is not right, that you are too arbitrary, that you are perverse. You think that you alone are right. You refuse to accept criticism, and your mistakes are many." It was clear to anyone who read this, who understood politics at the time, that Hai Rui stood for Peng Dehuai, and the emperor stood for Mao. And this was Peng Dehuai in 1959 remonstrating with Mao and telling him that the Great Leap Forward was wrong. This was just the tip of the iceberg. Other Beijing officials published other veiled attacks on Mao. Again, this is the period when Mao had been shunted aside, when everyone acknowledged that the Great Leap Forward had been a disaster. Mao didn't have enough influence in Beijing to stop it, but he did in Shanghai, where Jiang Qing, his wife, had a lot of influence in the cultural world. And they began launching attacks on writers and editors and political figures who wrote articles, beginning with an attack on Wu Han, the deputy mayor of Beijing, who was forced to apologize in 1965, and he apologized publicly and admitted that he had failed to follow Mao's theories. The humbling of Wu Han was enough to shock other of Mao's critics into coming on board with what is going to be the Cultural Revolution. It's going to bring Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping on board with Mao's Cultural Revolution, even though they don't quite realize it, but they are the two primary targets of this movement. By the end of the Cultural Revolution, Deng Xiaoping will be in prison. His son will be crippled after being thrust out of a window. Liu Shaoqi, the president, will be beaten in the streets and he'll die in prison. So, from the cultural attack, how does the big picture of the Cultural Revolution begin? Here, I got a picture for you because this is the picture that really launched the Cultural Revolution publicly. Mao swimming. Here he is, swimming along. July of 1966, Mao Zedong swam across the Yangtze River. Now, a little background here and some context. First of all, at this point in time, most Chinese people could not swim. It was not a regular practice. Mao was now 73 years old, and according to the official account, he swam all the way across the Yangtze River, which is about a mile wide, did it at 4 times the world record, and yes, he swam it at 4 times the world record. Basically, the news around the country, once sort of newsreel footage of this and images in the newspapers appeared of Mao here swimming across the Yangtze River, it would basically be like you waking up in the morning and looking at the news and it turns out that Queen Elizabeth just swam across the English Channel. Similar vein, that Mao, who everyone had thought was just on death's door, had 1 foot in the grave, this is a vision of vitality. Swimming was a vision of vitality and strength. Again, most people could not do it. And this harkened back to Mao's early days in Hunan when he'd go tramping through the mountains and living outdoors to experience a rougher kind of life to toughen him up for the revolution. This was a sign that Mao was still alive, that he was vital, that he was strong. Other images from it, less flattering. He kind of looks like a seal floating along here, but this is Mao in the Yangtze River. And the youth around China who had been brought up with the Little Red Book, being taught to adore Chairman Mao, they were ecstatic about this. The return of Mao, the guy that they had been reading about, all across China, people recreated his swim across the Yangtze by throwing themselves into local rivers in joy and flapping around and trying to swim. There were apparently many drownings at this point from people who couldn't swim but thought that their revolutionary fervor would carry them across the river. This is what launches the Cultural Revolution in earnest. The next month, at the 11th plenum, Mao Zedong got Liu Shaoqi in the Central Committee of the Communist Party in the Politburo, got Liu Shaoqi demoted from number 2 down to number 8. Lin Biao was moved up to number 2, essentially replacing the power of the state, Liu Shaoqi, the president, with Lin Biao, the army, and Mao's loyalists. Then he announced the creation of the Red Guards, who are young loyalists to Mao, aged about 9 to 18. These are students who adopt red armbands and call themselves the Young Guardians of Chairman Mao. These are young people, kids in school, who have been brought up on the glory of Mao Zedong, but not really believing that he was a part of their lives. And now he was back. It was as if God himself had come down to earth. Like there was Mao Jesus had come back. And they were told that they could be the successors to the revolution. These are young people who had grown up admiring Mao and admiring the revolution, lamenting that they hadn't been old enough to take part in the revolution. And now Mao was telling them that they could be the new leaders of this cultural revolution. They turned out to be an incredible force of destruction. One of their main slogans was, "It is right to rebel," and they rebelled against many, many things. in terms of the target of the Cultural Revolution, the target of the wrath of these young hyper-enthusiastic followers of Mao, these Red Guards. Mao, and it's in your documents, reader, wrote a big character poster entitled "Bombard the Headquarters." This was a call to arms for the Red Guards, and in that phrase, "bombard the headquarters," he indicated that the real target of the Red Guards would be the Communist Party and the government. The Red Guards staged huge rallies in the autumn of 1966 in Tiananmen Square, represented here, just endless throngs of youth and Red Guards marching in formation, waving their little red books, dreaming and hoping of somehow catching a distant glimpse of Chairman Mao on a podium off in the distance. I mean, it's like those images you see of when the Beatles first came to America and all their fans are screaming and crying and falling to the ground. Similar reactions on the faces of young Chinese students seeing Mao in the distance for the first time. 10 million young people were transported to Beijing free of charge, waving their little red books in the air like a weapon. Schools were shut down. Students were set free of their bonds. The teachers and parents who had ordered them around, now they could turn the tables and they could tell them what to do. And they unleashed a reign of terror against their parents, against their teachers, dedicated to smashing what were termed the four olds. The four olds were old thoughts, old customs, old culture, and old habits. Again, old thought, old custom, anything traditional about China. Old culture, old habits. Anything that was not deemed properly revolutionary. And so they attacked traditional culture, traditional art, traditional architecture, people who read classical Chinese, attacked anything Western, anyone who could speak English, anyone who had friends who were foreigners. They wrote big character posters. They ransacked houses. They burned property whenever they wanted. They burned books. They burned record albums. They destroyed art collections. Anything that seemed modern or Western, anything that seemed like it had not been simply designed to support Mao in the revolution. Mao ordered the police not to interfere in their interrogations. They could arrest and imprison people at will. They could torture them. They could kill them without being punishment. And as I said before, these are just children, 9 to 18 years old. The oldest of them are teenagers. The oldest of them are younger than most of you in this class. When we come back next time, we'll talk about where this all goes. This is going to leave a huge scar on China for generations to come. But it's going to last ultimately all the way up until Mao dies in 1976. So when we come back next time, the rest of the Cultural Revolution, and then how China moves on from it. All right. Thanks for being with me. Hope you are good and safe wherever you are. Hope you have toilet paper. But again, I hope you're all safe and that things aren't troubling you too much at this time. Thanks for watching the lecture, and I will see you next time.